Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Dan Lorenc and Josh Bressers. Thanks for being here, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this, this interesting, exciting topic that has the whole industry talking about it with you guys. But for folks that don't know you, you guys, Josh, do you want to start with a little bit of background?
Yeah, totally. So my name's Josh Bressers. I'm the vice president of security over at a company called Anchore. We've got a couple of open source projects a lot of people might have heard about called Sift and Gripe. We've got an enterprise product called Anchor Enterprise. We call ourselves a next generation source composition analysis. And then I do a bunch of wacky open source stuff. I've kind of been around forever. I've got a couple podcasts, the open source security podcast I love. I've got a podcast called Hacker History that's loads of fun. And I'm just kind of got my tendrils all over the security space. So I absolutely love it. And it's fantastic. And thanks for doing this, Chris. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. You guys are very passionate about the topic and know how to take us into the deep end on the nuances that we're going to dive into. But Dan, how about you? What's your background for folks that don't know you?
Yeah, my name is Dan Lorenc. I'm the co-founder and CEO of another startup called Chainguard. Before that, I was at Google for about 8 or 9 years doing much of open source security and vulnerability management stuff. So we are happy users of the Anchor, Sift, and Gripe tools and try to use every scanner that we can find out there to look for vulnerabilities in the open source software that we ship. So this topic is pretty near and dear to both me and Josh, I would assume.
Yeah, definitely. Big fan of the tools and big fan of both organizations. You both have been guests on the show before. But for topic of today, there's been a lot of buzz about the NVD, the lack of enrichment of CVEs and so on. Josh, can you, tee it up for us? What exactly is going on and what's the chaos that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I'd love to. All right, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Let's give this a go. I have a graph. I love graphs. So for anyone who doesn't know, I worked at Elastic for probably 5 years, give or take. And so I've become like this massive data nerd. All right, can you see my screen? I'll assume you can see my screen. So I've got a graph here of the NVD data, right? And the green bars are all of the CVEs that NVD takes in. And the red bars are the CVEs NVD enriches. And so what's happened for like the last 25 years, right? This is not something NVD just started doing, but for the last, 20 plus years, they have taken in the CVE data and they've added severity scores. They've added like affected products and versions. They've added CWE names, and then they just stopped. And there's a notice on their website, which I'm not going to share anything else, just this one graph. But there's a notice on their website where they basically said, hey, there's a delay in us processing various CVE information. And okay, I mean, I get a delay, but this is what happened, which we'll leave it up to the viewer to decide if that's a delay or not. And so this happened in middle of February, I think. And then it's been kind of just trying to figure out like what happens now. We've had this vulnerability data, the big one being the severities, because it's not a lot of people. It was funny. I remember I think it was Jerry Gamblin pointed this out way long ago in saying, oh, hey, look, like there's a delay. And people are like, oh, if you're relying on NVD, like you're doomed anyway. Except there's something like, I think, 12 federal standards in the US that specifically call out NVD severities as part of the standard. So like we're all kind of doomed now. And I mean, these are like, there's a bunch of challenges around that, right? There's from our perspective at Anchor, we've got Gripe, that uses, we call NVD our matter of last resort, where there are just certain ecosystems and certain packages that the vulnerability data exists nowhere but NVD, right? And so while we can argue about NVD, it's funny because we all complained about it till it's gone, and now we're like, it's gone, bring it back. But it definitely is a big deal, I think. I think NVD just kind of disappearing with no notice was a shock to the industry, quite frankly.
Yeah, how about from you, Dan? You started raising some concern around this and implications of it.
Yeah, I remember seeing the same, that warning when it popped up, like right around Valentine's Day. It was a nice little present, I guess, they left to us. I remember those jokes. And then I think you were the first one that noticed it wasn't just a pause, it was a real stop, Josh. You were the first one I saw that kind of made that graph and pointed it out. Just for a higher level context, too, so people kind of understand the broad picture here. The NVD stands for National Vulnerability Database. It's a big database of vulnerabilities. There's a bunch of other sources, but most of it eventually flows up into the NVD, and those are the things that get issued with like the CVE hyphen identifier. It's a big ecosystem. A lot of it's run by MITRE. It's this complicated series of government hierarchies and other agencies that manage parts of it. Um, over the last couple of years, there's been a big trend to federate the NVD management a little bit more in these things called CNAs. So CVE naming or numbering authority. I can never remember which one. Naming. Yeah. So other groups can also issue their own identifiers, but they still flow upstream into that national vulnerability database. And that piece is still happening. So these new CVEs are coming in. But when you say enrichment, there were a couple fields, though, that folks at NIST were still responsible for setting, notably the severity score, the CVSS one, and then that product matching one. And that's the really subtle one, that's the field that all of these scanners and other tools use to know what versions of software are actually affected. So if a new vulnerability in one of those pieces of software appears today, the NVD won't be able to match that to the software. So everybody's going to talk about the next, Heartbleed or Log4Shell or something like that, and that the information is just not going to be present in the vulnerability database that most folks rely on. Josh called out it's the one of last resort. There's a bunch of other ones now that have kind of sprung up, particularly in open source. Open source has always worked a little bit different in the NVD, where in open source code, you can see the exact lines of code that are affected. There's all these other databases that enrich way more than the NVD because they have access to that fine-grained information. And so a lot of tools and scanners and companies rely on that when it's present. And it's great. It's a lot more fine-grained. It's a lot more accurate. But those federal standards Josh mentioned, a lot of companies, even though these better tools and databases are available, the federal government mandates most federal agencies, anyone selling software to the government, use their source of truth, even if it's worse. And so that's where the problem starts to come in. You've got a whole bunch of government agencies on one hand saying you must use this data, and then another government agency that says, no, you can't rely on this for anything. So it leaves folks that are working with the government in a bit of a pickle here.
Yeah, citing quite a few, we talked about this earlier, but citing quite a few, things from FedRAMP to, NIST risk management framework, all the internal federal IT systems, SaaS the federal government's using, says you must be, remediating vulnerabilities based on NVD scoring and prioritization and so on. And it's very hard to do that when there's no data to do so. And we often talk about you can't protect what you don't see and so on. Well, if you can't map vulnerabilities to proxy in your ecosystem, you're kind of SOL. So Josh, I know your team is working on some efforts that you want to talk about in terms of providing some accompanying resources to the community to kind of offset the challenge that we have here. You want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah. So I mean, Anchor is in kind of a weird position like this because we need the data that NVD was our last resort for, and so just doing nothing basically wasn't an option. And so being a Red Hat has a lot of Red Hat DNA inside the company. Like I worked at Red Hat for a dozen years, long ago. And it seemed obvious that this is an open source sized problem. It feels like an open source solution is the most obvious here. And so we've been working for a little over a week now, furiously, just trying to kind of get all the ducks in a row. And we've created some repos. They're inside the Anchor organization at the moment. It's obviously not intended to be the long-term home. It's just we can work quickly by doing that. But we've created a repo that links to a couple others. And the intent is we can pull in some of this CVE data. There's certain processing we can do on it automatically because there's the new CVE5 format from MITRE is pretty good. And a lot of the CNAs are filling out like affected information. So we can kind of convert that into something that looks like NVD. And there's still more work to do. And we're talking to lots of people trying to get as much help as we can. If anyone's interested in helping, I mean, there's an aspect of building tooling. There's an aspect of analyzing the data of, being able to, for example, if tooling outputs something, you still got to look at it and be like, is the thing that got output actually the thing that's being described here? And so there's a ton of work to do, but I feel like this is one of those issues that open source is the logical way to solve. And I'll dig up the link, and I should be able to paste it. I'll put a comment in the stream here after we're done. But yeah, I mean it's open source, right? Like pull request welcome, so to speak. And we've got a bunch of information. I've written so much in the README over the last week. I can't even remember what's in it. But yeah, all in all, I feel like, and this is something I've talked to a handful of folks, even inside of the US government about, is just the fact that it is clear that even the US government can't deal with this problem because it's gigantic. And I mean, I'm not going to show it, but I have another graph just showing some of the growth of like the vulnerability universe. And we've gained about 20% per year. And the way the thing I mentioned was the number of vulnerabilities we had in 2021 was about half of what we're at this year, if you graph them together. Do you think the budget for NIST doubled since 2021 for NVD? I suspect the answer is no, right? And this is true of everywhere. Like everyone is being crushed by this just unrelenting, massive influx of vulnerabilities. And it's not just NVD, it's not one organization. Like we can either sit in our silos and be crushed to death, or we could try to work together. That's kind of the way we see it.
I had a question for both of you. A couple questions actually came in the chat that I'm going to pull on too as well. But, say you move towards this distributed kind of open source ecosystem driven model of contributors across the globe and so on. We know that can be very successful, but we know that there's a high bust factor, right? Or people quit maintaining things or so on and so forth from open source perspective. Plus there would be no kind of centralized authority that kind of validates all the entries, for example. Like, how do you see that playing out? Obviously we have a lot more participation and you can pull on more, hands to help fix things and get data into the database and contribute and so on. But what about the lack of an authoritative source to kind of validate everything? Or what if people, don't contribute as much as we hope? Or they, how do you guys foresee that playing in the distributed, kind of model that we're advocating potentially here?
Yeah, I can start with that one. It's, the CV database, the NVD up until now, it's always been somewhat distributed, right? I call it a world writable database, which is mostly true. Almost anyone can file a CV against any piece of software. For the most part, CNAs kind of introduce a bit of ownership and curation there, but it's been federated, and that's where that growth has come from, right? We have more and more people filing these each year. And to Josh's point, 20% year over year adds up quick when you're just looking at a 2 or 3 year period where effectively double new CNAs have come online. That's been part of the actual stated strategy and stated goal of the CV program, though, to get more things flowing into this. And so to see that then coupled with this completely foreseeable shortfall in funding and staffing on the other half is sort of the frustrating piece here. I don't think a distributed group can really replace the main value of NIST here. It can plug the short-term gap. But yeah, what we need is a central group that is trusted by the government to be doing the scoring. Even when they get things wrong, there are mechanisms where the community can correct them. I don't doubt that this group can get better data in there, but it's not going to be data that the government is going to trust, because the government is only really going to trust the data coming from them, which is where all of these standards and regulations that say you must use this data comes from. When you're looking at this from a liability perspective, if you miss a vulnerability scan because NIST had it wrong, that's going to look a lot different than if you miss a vulnerability scan because you and your team or somebody else messed something up. So it's one of those cases where the perfect solution from a security perspective isn't a perfect one from a compliance and regulatory one, which happens all too often here, I guess.
I mean, that's a great point. And this is something I spell out in the README of the project. It's like the only organization that can provide NVD severity scores is NVD. Right? No
definition,
one can do that. Right, exactly. So from our perspective, we're less interested in severities than we are in the matching logic. Because, I mean, even if you look at the data NVD had up to this date, like the severities you could debate those at length, and we have. But the matching logic is the one, like, matching logic is completely objective, right? There's no arguing whether something is or isn't affected. And that's the place that we're the most interested in, being able to kind of augment the data and like asking questions about, can we do this with open source? Can, what bus factors and all that stuff. And I would say the answer is, I don't think we have a choice. I don't think there's any other way to do this other than the US government giving, NIST an infinite supply of money. And honestly, even if you had that, I don't think you could find enough people to do all the work. So it is, and look, this is a lot of unknowns. I'm not saying this is a solution. Anchor has no intention of replacing any of the existing infrastructure or ecosystems. Like CVE is not going away. It's going to continue to exist. But anyone in this space who's been doing this work, like, find me a vulnerability analyst who likes NVD or likes CVE. You can't. Yeah. Right? There's plenty of room here. And this is one of those places, like, open source gives us an easy way to iterate quickly, try things out, see what works, see what doesn't work. And then maybe another organization farther up the food chain can be like, that's a good idea. We're going to start doing that. There's a lot of unknowns here. But again, fundamentally, at the end of the day, like, Gripe needed the data. We need to do something. We're going to do it in the open. That's the way we see it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I had another
it's the
question
only
for.
thing
Go
that's
ahead,
going to
Dan.
work short term. Yeah, I completely agree. It's you talk about the complaints. It's that old adage, like there's two kinds of vulnerability databases: the ones no one uses and the ones people complain about. Yeah, it's for all the crap we've given them in the past, right? It's served an incredibly important purpose for the last 25 years since it's existed. It's not perfect, but it's the bad that we know and the bad that we're all using today. And filling in these gaps is the right approach until we hear something from NIST. The statement that we didn't link to and publish said something about a consortium. Um, that's a kind of scary word, especially when everybody that you would think in the industry, it's a small industry of people that actually stare at and care at these things. Nobody that you would think would be in that consortium knows anything about the consortium yet either. These things take time. They take time to spin up. I know the solution is going to be somewhat federated, but it's going to have to be governed by them in the end if they're going to accept it. And the fact that we just haven't heard anything about it is pretty troubling.
Yeah, I want to ask you as well. There's been some comments coming in about kind of throwing shade at CPE and its value of tying to products and components and so on. And it's no shortage of criticism. And I know you guys have some pretty interesting thoughts around the future of CPE and alternatives and so on. So feel free to kind of opine on that too.
It's Perl. The answer is Perl. P-U-R-L, not P-E-R-L. It's funny. Every time I say Perl, like I shudder a little bit because I was a Perl developer, P-E-R-L, like decades ago. but package URLs, they're a phenomenal solution. And I think it is probably the most plausible thing that is going to solve this problem for us, is my guess.
Yeah, Perl agree it's the closest. There's some cool version range scheme stuff too that the OSV folks have done to extend Perl because you want to be able to say it's in these versions, not this version. Track that across releases. Perl today still somewhat struggles with the proprietary type software, but CP struggles the other way. So it's gonna take some extensions here or there, but none of it is insurmountable.
That's right.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in terms of the proprietary versus the open source software ecosystem and trying to kind of balance both those demands and use cases. There's also an effort that you have underway, Dan, in terms of an open letter to Congress, right, to kind of raise awareness around this issue, the impact and the implications of it. You want to talk about that a little bit and where that's headed?
Yeah, sure. To Josh's point, 20% more CVs year over year, even if NIST's budget were flat, which it wasn't this year, it was actually slashed by 20%. That's not enough to guarantee the stability of this thing. It's a government created problem in some ways. They're the ones that told people we have to use this database. And probably some different folks at the government are the ones that couldn't scrounge up funding and shut the thing down. So we started an open letter. We can link the draft to it here, just to raise awareness of it, because it seems like one of those classic issues. If you're inside a company and two teams are disagreeing, you escalate. The goal of that is basically to raise awareness of how big a problem this is going to be, both for the government themselves. The government's the largest purchaser of software in the world. They're under the most attack in many areas too, to raise awareness of how big the problem is going to be for them, as well as the value of this database to the overall industry. I don't know what it costs to run this thing, but there's no possible way it's a bad investment, just given the amount of dollars that the overall industry and the government is seeing too from a return perspective. So there's a draft here. You can jump on to sign it. We're almost finished with the first draft, which we're hoping to wrap up by tomorrow. Get it shared with publications and press. There's already been a bunch of interest that way, just to help escalate it and get it to the level that we need to help the government fix their own problem.
Yeah, I'm going to drop a link to that letter in the chat here. And so, you guys have pretty well articulated the issue here and the implications of it. We can't predict the future, but there's some rumors that NIST and NVD are going to make some announcement at VolnCon next week to kind of elaborate on the issue and where things are headed. What do you foresee them saying, and where do you see this going from here?
Okay, I want to complain about this first, because the answer to a lot of questions in a number of places I've asked was, we're going to talk about that at VolnCon. And in all of my years, my many, many years of being in industry, when you have some sort of problem and people keep saying, we're going to talk about that at this conference, it has been solved 0 times when that happens. And so that's my biggest concern, is I think there's all this like hopes and dreams being pushed onto VolnCon, and I suspect it's going to be a very disappointing answer when it comes there. I think this is the sort of thing, like, there is no reason NVD can't just tell us what the heck is going on, right? We don't need to wait for some conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. Just write a freaking email or something, put it on your website. Like, it's not that hard.
Yeah, I can't agree more. VolnCon, great conference. We're sending a couple folks. there's no reason. Like, you announce new products and flashy new things at conferences. You don't update the world on what's going on with the vulnerability information in a keynote. That's not how these things happen. I heard rumors too about that announcement at VulnCon. I also heard no one from NVD is going to VulnCon because they don't have travel budget. So we'll see.
Oh my, Dan.
Yeah, that could be interesting. But I agree with both of you. You know, this is a pretty pervasive, widely used system across the entire globe, basically. For folks to have to tune into some, you know, kind of, I want to say obscure, but, you know, smaller event at a particular location that, you know, everyone's not going to is not the best way to communicate this information. So I think we deserve better transparency and broader communication. That's a kind of some parting thoughts from each of you. You know, what are some things aside from, you know, we talked about kind of a hybrid model of government funding and participation, but also the open source distributed ecosystem type model. Any kind of parting thoughts or commentary around, you know, where we need to go to kind of fix this?
There's a couple of questions in chat too.
Please
kind
throw them.
And I'll kind of bridge that in. There's a bunch of messages in here too about Europe and commenting on that. We're already kind of going to be living in this world of multiple vulnerability databases. Like, it's called the National Vulnerability Database, not the international or global one or anything like that. Europe is planning to roll out their own for probably the same reasons the US wants people to use their own. I hope that whatever we come up with in the open source side flows downstream into all of these, and the governments don't completely reinvent the wheel and build something completely incompatible. Because 90 to 98% of the software is open source, and we have many great solutions for the open source already, but it's not everything. There is still proprietary software in there. So I sort of hope whatever we do flows downstream that way. But we're past all the chances of having the NVD be the only single source of truth for the world before this event even happened. I don't think this is going to help.
Not only that, but I think there's geopolitical interests and so on that play a part in each nation, or some nations, right, wanting to have their own kind of database for software vulnerabilities for various purposes, you know, between nations that have either a cooperative relationship or a hostile relationship. So I don't think we'll see one database to rule them all.
No. I mean, there's the Chinese NVD, there's CNNVD that has, it's a lot of the similar data. I know ENISA in Europe has been tasked with creating some sort of vulnerability database. Now, I mean, here's one of the things that does concern me is there was, ENISA had a big kind of roundtable meeting. I bet it's been 6 months, maybe 8 months. I forget. It's been a while. And basically everyone who was there came together and said, look, please don't create another database. We already have one. Like, find a way to work together, right? And I think they took that away as one of the results of the meeting. And I'm very concerned, like the current events we're witnessing, ENISA is going to be like, we can't rely on this. We've got to go our own way now. And now we'll have 3 vulnerability databases, and then there'll be 4. And that's not necessarily bad, because there can be, I mean, here's an example I have, right? So there's GitHub has their vulnerability database, and it's phenomenally good, but it's very tightly scoped. And I know, like, I've been trying to work with them for a long time. I'm like, please let me add this one thing I want to add. And they're like, no, it's out of scope. And I respect that, because by keeping a tightly constrained scope, it lets you accomplish things that you couldn't accomplish if it was a looser scoping, right? So I'm not saying it's a bad thing by any means, but like, GitHub's data only covers what GitHub's data covers, right? Like, that's how they built it. That's how it worked. NVD is a little more broad. You've got other data sets that are going to cover what they want to cover. And then the challenge, just as industry, is going to become, how do we kind of bring all this stuff in? How do we collate it together? What does that mean for everyone trying to sort all this out? Because then you also run into the issues, you know, as a company that builds a vulnerability scanner, you have a customer says, I just scanned my product with your thing, and then I scanned it with this other thing, and they're different. And it's like, I know. And it's because you've got this Venn diagram of data sources, and depending upon how you've configured your stuff, you're going to get different results, which is, of course, also, it's almost impossible for the end users to even understand all this, because it's so horrendously complicated and bizarre. And yeah, I guess that's the thing I just have in my head, is this is going to make the complexity so much worse.
Yeah, many organizations and practitioners are already struggling with disparate findings among tools. I know, Chainguard's put out some great information about, container scanning tools and differences in findings, for example. And not only that, but you're drowning in vulnerability findings that you do have, either from a single or multiple tools. This is a very complicated challenge, and I don't see it getting easier. It's only going to get more complex as more databases, sources, et cetera, come into the fold.
Yep. and 20% bigger every year.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's a case that like only the largest organizations are going to be able to deal with the noise, and it's going to make it even harder for the government to procure secure software. All of those concerns that I know you're passionate about, Chris. You're going to have to fix all of the vulnerabilities, even the ones that conflict with all the other ones in this new multi-database world.
We appreciate you jumping on today, gentlemen. Any kind of parting thoughts, commentary, where folks can find out more about the work you're up to, things like that?
I mean, I'll put a link to the project Anchor has. I mean, you go to anchor.com, anchore.com, and we've got some, blogs and all that kind of jazz about everything going on. But yeah, I'll throw some links down in the chat once we're done here. But I mean, kind of I guess I have two big parting thoughts I give. Is number one is just please be patient. I know this is chaos and it's difficult and it's easy to yell at people and accuse people of being dumb or mean or evil or whatever. And it's everyone in this space is like horribly overworked. And I think we've kind of reached the point where some of the structure that was holding it all up is collapsing, and it's scary and it's terrible, and just patience, right? We're working on it. And then I think the other part is just like, don't just complain, find somewhere to help. There's a lot going on in this space. Obviously, there's things Ancor is doing, but like there's things the Linux Foundation is doing, the OpenSSF. You've got, GitHub has a public data set. Go enrich it, right? You can add data to their stuff. There's so much happening all over the place that don't complain. Like, come help. Goodness knows there's plenty to do, and everyone would love the help for sure.
Yeah, I hope that somehow this can turn into a positive outcome. It's this, load-bearing piece of infrastructure for the entire world that maybe somebody just didn't realize was as load-bearing as it was. We've all accidentally turned off a system in production we didn't realize somebody was still using. I hope we can get it back in shape and reinforce it and build it up into the piece of infrastructure we all need it to be.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think we've maybe taken it for granted, at least, some of us in the community, and now it's kind of crumbling. Our infrastructure, our digital infrastructure is crumbling, and we're starting to say, wow, we need to kind of make some modernization, some improvements, both technologically and process-wise. So I think you're both spot on, and thank you both for joining us. That's Josh Bressers with Anchor and Dan Lorenc with Chainguard. Thank you, gentlemen, and thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for
Chris.
chatting.